Dr. Gordy Hill, it is such an honor to have you on the Millhouse podcast. I've heard of your name for so many years with your good friends Paul Dixon and others. Your reputation precedes you, very much so. But for the most part, I think you've kind of flown under the radar. And for all of the audience out there, Dr. Hill is one of the foremost hip replacement surgeons in the country back when you were doing all these surgeries. And at one time, you were, I think, doing more than anyone. The president of the Hip Society said every significant development in the field of total hip replacement during the last 10 years came out of Dr. Gordy Hill's operating room.
Yeah, he said that when I was at the meeting and announced my retirement.
Right. You were also up for a Nobel Prize in medicine. And you collaborated with Dr. Roger Haugen, a pathologist and chief of the blood bank at Holy Cross Hospital, to successfully process a patient's own blood for an infusion. This was during the AIDS crisis when healthy people were contracting AIDS from a routine blood transfusion. You and Dr. Haugen were nominated for the Nobel Prize in Medicine for this medical achievement.
May I correct you for a minute? You pronounce his name Haugen. Roger Haugen.
Haugen, okay. And then we're going to talk a little bit about that, but I'd also like to, read something that you wrote recently. Over my years, I have also thrilled to the leap of a large Atlantic salmon or that of a much smaller landlocked salmon. Then there is the spectacular leap of a big mako shark. I also love the amazing way a hooked spinner shark twists and spins around in the air. I still recall with pleasure the shining silvery leap of a trophy-sized queenfish, the aerobics of an Australian Saratoga in the billabongs, or a leaping sheefish above the Arctic Circle. Then there are sometimes awesome leaps that billfish make. Tattooed onto my brain is the vertical leap of a broad-bill swordfish as it tries to spear a full moon as it comes shooting up like a Polaris missile. Though I've tried many times, I've never hooked one on fly, and now that I'm no longer young, never will. You have had an amazing life. Before we get into the fishing, let's go back to your medical life. How were you inspired? I know that your father, Pop Hill, and your grandfather, Clifford Hewitson, I think his name is.
No, Clifford Hewitson.
Hewitson. They really inspired you at a young age. You said you started throwing a fly at the age of 5.
The truth is I was young enough that I don't remember them showing me how to do it, which they obviously did. So it might have been even before that.
Right.
I used my grandfather's bamboo rod because the only 2 fly rods we had back then, remember I was born in 1930, were made out of bamboo or else greenheart. Those are the only fly rods we had.
Right. And then also, too, I know that Joe Brooks was really a mentor to you at a very young age as well.
Yes.
And your family members.
Yeah. Joe was born in 31. My father was born, not 31, 01. Right. And my father was born in 02. I was born in 1930.
Right. What did your father do for a living?
He was, prior to the Second World War, a principal in a business school in Flushing, Long Island, New York.
And so how did you move and gravitate to medicine?
Oh, I knew I wanted to be a doctor when I was in high school.
Do you remember when that light switch went off?
It didn't go off. It materialized gradually. I was interested in science. At one point, I wanted to be an astronomer. I was interested in advanced mathematics and that sort of thing. And then my mentor became my family doctor, Dr. Tita, in Port Washington, New York. He was a wonderful man, and I admired the way he treated his patients, including those in my family as well as me. I wanted to be like him.
Well, good for you. How did you gravitate to orthopedics?
Okay, long story, but tellable. I'll keep it brief. I was, during medical school, absolutely fascinated with neurology and neurosurgery. I had made up my mind I was going to become a neurosurgeon. I had after graduating from medical school, I had my internship in Boston and arranged it so, although I didn't get any orthopedic training at all there, I had 2 stints on neurosurgery, and I loved every minute of it. I then had arranged I applied for a residency at the Massachusetts General Hospital, which is the Harvard Medical School, and was accepted for residency in neurosurgery. At that time, there was it was right at the end of the Korean War, and the government had adjudicated that any MDs, doctors, were subject to the draft until they were 58 years old. Whoop! I didn't want to get into practice and then have to leave for 2 years and do my duty and then try to come back and rebuild a practice. So I volunteered. I entered the Army. It was a paratrooper base at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and they made me a commanding officer of a field hospital, which is like a MASH. But this one was all packed up, ready to fly out and parachute in somewhere.
Wow.
We never did that because peace reigned. And I decided to do what all red-blooded American boys should do, and that's go fishing. Well, I hadn't had any money during my training. Gee whiz, I was married and had a couple of kids when I was an intern and a resident. My wife used to have to hunt for bottles to take back to get the return 5 cents or 2 cents so we'd have dinner, because I had 2 kids to support and no money. As an intern, I made $25 a month.
Wow.
And you can't raise 2 kids on that and pay rent too. Okay, but we got by. Now you'll see where I'm going with this. The first thing I did when my first Army paycheck was buy an outboard motor.
That's such a great story.
Yeah. Did you harvest a bunch of these fish for dinner to feed your family in those early years?
Yes. Oh, yes. That was a given.
What was your favorite fish at that point?
To eat or to catch?
Both.
Okay. My favorite fish to catch was a bluefish over 20 pounds. I loved those big, fast-fighting bluefish. Now, my friends like Paul Dixon, who is probably one of the best guides on the planet, and my other good friends at Montauk don't understand why I don't say, well, I'd prefer to catch tuna, and I've caught a lot of them on fly, or striped bass, because those are the it fish.
They're glamorous.
Yeah, but the bluefish fights on that, and he jumps better, and I love fish that jump.
Right.
But we didn't have tarpon on Long Island. I didn't even know what they were.
Right.
Anyway, with that as a background, I went fishing on a lake on the reservation at Fort Bragg, where they had some marvelous bass fishing. And I had my outboard motor in my trunk. It was all of 5 horsepower. Well, I met an older guy there, and he had a little skiff, but he didn't have any outboard. And you can imagine, we got together pretty quick. He turned out to be the full colonel who was in charge of the orthopedic surgery department at the Womack Army Hospital there. He had been a full professor of orthopedic surgery at the prestigious Steindler Clinic in Iowa, but he had joined the Army for many reasons, one of which was that his wife had a chronic medical problem and he could get free medical care there, but he was a wonderful chief. And after a day of bass fishing together, he said, I can get you TD'd to my hospital. TD, of course, is temporary duty in Army language. And I said, you're on. We shook hands on it. The next day, he had me TD'd from the field hospital to the Womack Army Hospital. And for 2 years, he was my mentor. And he taught me orthopedic surgery. By the time I finished there, I had done almost 600 major operations under his tutelage.
Wow.
As a result of which, the American Board of Orthopedic Surgery granted me a full year of residency training surgery, and I hadn't even had my residency.
Good for you.
It was a win-win.
Yeah.
I love that old man.
It's interesting how fishing brought you into your profession, orthopedic surgery.
Okay, you brought it up. Let me go back. I wanted to get a residency at Bellevue Hospital in New York City because they offered the greatest experience for young orthopedic surgeons being trained. And I went in and had my interview. And the professor there was a crusty old fellow about as old as I am now. I'm 90. And he was sitting in a great big oak desk. And of course, I'm the applicant, and I'm sitting down there looking up at him, you know. But what prevailed over all else was the fact that above his head, mounted on the wall, was a bonefish. Well, I had already caught my first bonefish on a visit to Florida, and I opened with saying, "Sir, that's a beautiful bonefish up there." We talked about bone fishing and permit fishing for an hour and a half. He never asked me any other questions, and he stood up and said, "I like the cut of your jib. You got the job." Well, it didn't end there because he said, you can start in 3 years. I said, "Sir, I've got 3 children to bring up. I don't have any money, and I got to start now." He says, "I'll take care of that." I don't know what he did, but I got the job and could start immediately. So yeah, fishing has helped me in many ways.
Oh,
That's
amazing.
amazing.
Yeah. Also, too, how did this Nobel Prize in medicine come to be? Because here you're an orthopedic surgeon, and you're starting to talk and study blood infusions. How did that come about?
It had nothing to do with the blood, except for the fact that we had a method of providing blood for surgical patients, which was proven. Roger Haugen and I had been doing this for 10 years. So we had the numbers with statistics that had realistic P factors. Okay, and we published that in the May of, I don't remember the exact year, in the American Journal of Medicine, and it was acclaimed because just at that point people were wondering what the heck to do with respect to blood transfusions when people were getting AIDS from these transfusions.
And let's not forget that Arthur Ashe contracted AIDS with a blood transfusion.
You bet. Now, we didn't do it in the beginning 10 years before that because of AIDS, because that hadn't been an issue yet. The only experience I'd had possibly with AIDS was back in medical school in the 50s when they presented a case of a person who apparently had lost his immune system and nobody knew what that meant. They didn't have a name for it, so they presented it as a curiosity case. I never saw another case until years later. And of course, AIDS, by the time we published this paper, was not only prevalent, but a disaster in many sectors.
For sure.
We did it because of hepatitis B. We had had several patients who had gotten transfusions at our hospital in Fort Lauderdale get hepatitis B as a result of blood transfusions, and that was our target. But it turned out to be just great to be able to give transfusions and know that it'd be a low likelihood of our patients getting AIDS.
Right.
Now, this was frozen blood. I give the credit to Roger Haugen for the lab stuff that he did, figuring out how to safely freeze this blood after separating the cells from the plasma. Whereas on my end of it, I was taking blood from a patient as he was on the operating table by suctioning it from the wound instead of letting it go on the sponges and the drapes and that sort of thing. And we figured out a method of filtering that blood so we could put that blood right back in the patient as it's being lost.
Wow.
So it was a compound paper. Well, I didn't get the Nobel Prize for that. I was mentioned.
Right.
And
you were nominated for a prize, right?
but somebody else got the Nobel Prize.
But that's still big.
Yeah.
Do you remember what won the prize that year?
I don't remember.
Yeah. It's a fascinating story. What is the highlight of your medical career? Possibly that nomination for a Nobel Prize?
It all depends on how you look at it. I was known for... well, let me go back a little bit. In doing the total hip replacement, I was the 6th surgeon in the United States to do the procedure. I had learned it from Sir John Chaunley in England, and also Professor Müller in Switzerland came back to the States. There were 5 other surgeons who had done the procedure. I didn't talk with any of them. I just got the materials and the prosthesis from England and went and did it, having learned it. Now, the United States government put the kibosh on the importation of the polymethyl methacrylate, which is the cement that was used to hold the prosthesis in position.
Why would they do that?
Because they felt that it hadn't been studied well enough in this country.
So the FDA put a block on it?
Yes.
Okay.
For 2 or 3 years, I can't remember exactly for how long. But I had already used it, having gotten it from North Hill Plastics in London, and I had a nice supply of it. Because I figured something like that might happen.
Right.
So I was doing total hip replacements when none of the other surgeons in the United States could get the cement to do it.
You were stockpiling.
Uh-huh.
Good for you.
Yeah.
How much difference is there today in hip replacement versus when you were doing it?
There's a lot of differences, but the way it's done today, mostly around the world, is a method that I had presented at the Harvard Medical School years after I had done many of them.
Wow.
You see, there were multiple methods by that time of doing a hip replacement. The cement method worked very well in the beginning, but the cement would come loose after a few years and provide all kinds of problems.
Right.
There was a higher rate back then of infection with the total hip replacements, especially done with cement. So it led to a search for other methods of fixation. There was the use with respect to the socket of screws to hold the socket in place. There was methods of screwing the prosthesis with a thread-like surface into the bone and that sort of thing, and cement, and that's all there was. Well, I had a real disaster on my hands. I had to figure how to handle this. I was in surgery. I drilled a hole in the man's pelvis to put the screw in to hold the socket in place, and he bled out of that hole. It turns out that in drilling in there, I had hit a little-known artery up in the pelvis.
Oh.
Yeah. Now, Harry Rubash at the Harvard Medical School studied a lot of pelvis cases and did a lot of anatomic dissection of pelvises, and he found a high incidence of that artery in his specimens going into the area where you might be drilling a hole to put a screw in to hold the socket in place. But here's what I did. I packed that hole with gel foam and topical thrombin, which are things that help stop bleeding, and I got the bleeding stopped. I figured, now, I don't want to put cement in there with that. I'm sure not going to put another screw in there, so I got to figure something different. So what I did was to use a hemispherical bone ingrowth prosthesis that was 4 millimeters larger in diameter than the opening in the pelvis, and I impacted it into place. The bone ingrowth surface being rough, it held just beautifully. I couldn't move it. I had it in the perfect position. I figured, okay, I'm going to take a deep breath with this, because nobody had ever done that before that I ever knew. And then I put in the femoral component in a standard way, closed him up, and he did fine. Well, that was the beginning. I figured, wait a minute, if this fellow's doing fine with an impacted press-fit prosthesis, why don't I do some more of these cases and see how it works? Now, before doing that, I needed to get permission to do experimental surgery. I did this as a matter of an emergency, and it worked. But I was not a known experimental surgeon. I didn't have a an experimental number, which the government gave out back then, or anything. Well, I had a patient, very wealthy man whose name I won't, because you'd know who it was, wanted to have me do a total hip on him. He couldn't get anybody else to do it with the cement because of the government rule. Right. He didn't want to go to Switzerland. He didn't want to go to England. And he was a good friend of Dickie Nixon, who, remember, was our president.
Sure.
So he arranged for me to meet with Nixon and what was his sidekick's name? Rebozo.
Right.
On Grand Key, which was right up my alley.
In the Bahamas.
Yeah. Because
you can operate in the morning and bonefish in the afternoon.
There you go. Yeah. So we met, and my patient was there too, big donor, and we had a discussion about this. And Nixon and Rebozo had a little private conference, and they came back and they said, "We're going to give you an investigational exemption number." Ha! I couldn't have been more happier.
Wow.
Because now I could do them with that number. And I did them all that way. And they turned out beautifully.
Like they say, it's good to know people in high places.
Yeah. And sometimes in low places. Well, I presented, after doing a couple of hundred of them, I presented my cases as an invitational lecturer at the Harvard Medical School, and showed slides exactly how to do it and all that. Very rightly, the professor there, who was Bill Harris, wonderful guy, marvelous surgeon, and a better teacher, one of the best teachers in the world, which I guess is why he was at Harvard and was chief of surgery there. He decided to send a team down to study my cases. Good move. They sent a team down, including Tom Smallsreed, who I think now is chief at UCLA of orthopedics. We called him Tom Tallsreed because he was 7'3" or something like that in height, And anyway, those guys stayed for several days. They went through all of my previous x-rays, before and after x-rays, with my permission and my patient's permission. They interviewed cases where I had already done them, and they scrubbed with me up in surgery to watch me do it. So Bill Harris was doing his homework before he'd subscribed to that.
Right.
I remember one time at Harvard, I was also lecturing on how to get specimens from the hip joint to see whether there's an infection or not by putting a needle in the hip. And they had a very low yield of positive cultures. I had a 97% yield. And I went through all the critical steps to describe how I did that and got such a high percentage of results. When I got finished with that, the guys kind of sighed. There were some 500 or 600 surgeons there. And Bill Harris, who remembers was chief of surgery there, he said, "Well, Dr. Hill, we thank you for your presentation. Let's hope we're not held to those standards." So I've had an interesting life with this
Yes,
stuff.
you have. What about the Lenox Hill knee brace? As a skier, I had a number of operations. And I think in my early years, I think Joe Namath had a Lenox Hill knee brace. Did that have anything to do with your name, Lenox Hill?
No.
Okay.
No.
But that was a great try, Dad.
Yeah. It would sound nice, but no, I had nothing to do with that.
Right.
It came from the fact that was from Lenox Hill Hospital.
Right. Now, were you fishing during these years where you were operating so profusely?
Oh, yes. I could do as many as 7 total hip replacements in a day.
So you would work hard and take time off to travel?
I'd work my ass off to get a weekend so I could fish. Also, I built an orthopedic practice that was second to none as far as I know.
So you were making money on everybody else's work.
I ended up owning, I bought the other guys out and ended up owning the Fort Lauderdale Orthopedic Group. And at the time of my retirement, we had 10 active orthopedic surgeons. So you see, I had plenty of guys to put on call
Sure.
to take care of my patients when I was out fishing.
Right.
I set it up that way.
Yeah.
And I'm an energetic guy like you are, and I always have been. Let's see how you do when you're 90.
I see this. I see this very much.
So when you retired, did you come straight down here to the Keys?
Sure. Who wouldn't?
To Big Pine?
Yeah. Yeah.
And you've been here ever since?
See, I brought my boat back because, I don't think we've covered that, but this is germane to the present story. Priscilla and I, my wife, I married her when we were 17. We're about to have our 70th wedding anniversary.
Wow. Congratulations.
Yeah.
That's
and we're
unbelievable.
very, very much in love still, and fortunately have our health. Another story. Okay, we were members at the Crown Colony Club at Chub Key, and I kept my boat there at the docks. I had a couple of other boats in Fort Lauderdale, but this one was a beautiful marlin boat. It was a 38-foot Rybovich, and I mean, it raised fish. Oh, just wonderfully. And got many, many stories there. But then I sold it after it had caught fire and was at risk for more fires for reasons that we don't need to get into here. Mm-hmm. And I didn't think it was safe, so I got rid of that boat, and I bought a 51-foot Carolina hull built by Julian Guthrie in North Carolina, made for those North Carolina seas.
Right.
Pair of Cummins 370s diesels, and she was a marvelous boat. 18-foot beam in the stern. She drew 5.5 feet. Now think about going around the Bahamas and drawing 5.5 feet. You got to know where you're going.
Right.
So I studied navigation. I was always big on mathematics and all that, and became a pretty damn good pilot. Now at Chub Key, I had a captain. He was a Bahamian. You had to. And I had a couple of Bahamian mates, except when my two boys were off for the summer and then they mated, you know. But the Bahamian government wanted to conscript the boat and the captain and mates to go shoot Cubans because they were accusing them of poaching lobsters on the Grand Bahama Bank. And I could see there was no way around this. So I called and ordered my captain to bring my boat back to the States. He didn't know this, so he doesn't make a call when he crosses the 3-mile limit. And I get stung because it's an American documented vessel, and had to and was fined $5,000 for that. This is a side story, but you might find it interesting. So I called my surveyor, who was one of the biggest surveyors in South Florida, and his daughter just happened to be sleeping with one of the Coast Guard admirals, and she got it all taken care of.
Like I said, it's good to know people in high places,
Yeah.
and or low places.
Yeah, so I brought the boat back to the States, sold it, and came down here. Now, in preparation for that, that would have been when I was 65 years old. Back in the 70s, I had been looking for properties here in the Keys. We went all up and down the Keys. I wanted a place where the fishing was best, where there were fewer guides. Of course, in the 60s when we fished here, there were no guides at Key West except for Gainey Maxwell, and you know who he was.
I've just heard of his name. I don't know his reputation.
Oh, well, he ran a jet ski boat. Not jet ski, a jet boat out of Key West Harbor, and he was the only flats guide there. He retired, and then he bought a big Hatteras, and we used to have him tow our skiffs out to dry Tortugas.
That's 75 miles away from Key West. I can't
Yeah.
even imagine the fishing back then.
Fantastic. There were no other boats and nobody fishing the flats. And for permit, it was unbelievable because these permit had never seen an angler before.
So there was bonefish, permit, and tarpon, or just permit?
All of the above.
All the above.
There was so many tarpon, it got tiresome. I mean, all you had to do was anchor in the Garden Key Harbor and cast a fly off the stern day or night at any time, and your chance of hooking up onto a nice tarpon was close to 100%.
What about sight fishing tarpon over there?
Oh, yes, flats. We even sight fished groupers that came up on the rock flats.
Really?
Yeah, and tarpon, just wonderful. I remember one day we were with Gainey. We called him Gamey because he would stop at a shrimper and get a whole bunch of bycatch.
Yes.
He'd shovel it off onto the foredeck. And one night we're sleeping on the boat in the Garden Key Harbor, and Eddie Blumberg, who was one of our fishermen and a good friend, also a doctor, he was sleeping on the upper bunk by an open window, and the rain came and washed some of that chum into his bunk and all that. Well, Gainey, while we were fishing the next day, cleaned it all up, and for the next 2 weeks he stunk.
You can't get rid of that.
No.
Gamey.
Anyway, we were. He had a young kid as a mate. I don't remember his name. Nice kid, and we were all standing on the flat when a big tide came in. And we're looking for a tarpon and not seeing any tarpon. And the tide is coming in, and we had Gamey's skiff with us. Well, he took it back to the ship to get something for us to eat for lunch, so he's gone. We're on the flat, 1.5 miles away from the skiff. The water now is up above our waists, and it's coming up. I'm a short guy, but so it's coming up close to my chest, when all of a sudden the tremendous fin of a hammerhead shark looked like it was about 5 feet high off the water, and he's coming slowly right toward us, and there were 4 of us standing there together. Well, the kid, the mate, was right next to me. He says, "I don't want to die. I don't want to die." I says, "Well," I said, "come closer to me," because he felt, but we were still pretty close together. The shark came right for us, and it passed between the kid and me so that I could feel its tail as it went past.
Oh, my
Never
Lord.
touched us.
Oh, my God.
Never touched us.
That's crazy.
But,
Well, before we get into the fishing, I just want to ask you a little bit. You've had a number of issues with boats.
yes, I have.
I mean, the list goes on and on about boats sunk, engine fires, explosions. You got hit by a tornado, you and your father.
Yes.
And your good friend, Bob Andrea.
Bob Andre.
Yeah, tell me about that. Where were you? It was a Hughes, I think it was, right?
It was a Hughes bonefisher, redfisher. No, it was my bonefisher before I bought a redfisher. Doesn't matter. We were out off West Content. We had already taken 3 permit on fly. It was one of those days. Beautiful, beautiful day in June. The perfect one. Hardly any breeze, perfect sight fishing. Fish that were willing, and no guides out there, nobody else.
Is this the 70s or 80s?
This was in the late 70s. Yeah, right after Bob had started making those skiffs.
Right.
Yeah, I've had 4 of them along the way because I love those Hughes skiffs, and I would have him make them to my specifications and all. So I don't remember exactly which boat it was. Doesn't
Right.
matter. And we see not a funnel cloud, but a big black tornado out in the Gulf. And we figured, it's a perfect day, but this thing might be coming toward us. Bob Andre was with me, my dad, and me, 3 of us. This weather started coming toward us slowly, and building. And there was a huge tornado in it. This is not a water spout. Oh, we put up with water spouts for years, and we know how to avoid them. Which is the way to handle water spout.
Right.
Well, except for Jeffrey Cardenas, who that story.
Sure.
Where he took his into it. I was there that day. He took it into a water spout to see what would happen and survived it.
What happened?
Nothing. He was able to get in it, and when you're in the middle of it, it's calm. And then he raced out of it, no damage.
But you guys got hit by this tornado.
Oh,
on this
yeah.
day.
We pulled into the Content Passage. I then pulled up to West Content, and there was a mangrove tree with a trunk about almost, not quite, maybe about 10 inches in diameter. And we tied up to that. It's shallow water, and there's a sand beach there. It's where the old government tide marker that was put there for World War II was still there, and there was an eagle's nest on it. Oh, I remember that well. We didn't want to tie up to that because it's metal, and if a storm hits,
Sure.
you're going to get pounded to pieces. This way, we got a sandbar, and my bow is on the sand, tide's coming in, and we're tied up to the tree. And we figured, we're safe here. Well, that tornado came into the content passage between east content and west content, turned like it had been programmed to do it, and came right for us. Well, the whole world goes before you when that happens. It's dark. The wind is more than you can imagine. It was a wet tornado with rain, and it came upon us, knocked down this big mangrove tree that we were tied to, threw me about 50 feet in one direction, and Bob about 30 feet in the other direction. And it seemed like the end of the world. You don't know which end is up. You don't know whether you're alive or not. And it passed quickly, went on to Knock 'em Down Key, which is well named because it knocked down a bunch of trees there. Then we later found out that it went across to Cudjoe Key, took some roofs off some houses, and went out into the Gulf Stream. Excuse me. Well, my dad stayed in the boat. Why? Because the tree had fallen on my push-pole tower, which prevented it from killing Pop, but it had landed softly because it had hit the push-pole tower first,
Right.
and hit him in the head, knocked his head down into the dish of my steering wheel, and now the tide's going out and there's blood everywhere. We figured the old man's dead. Well, he wasn't. He just had a bloody nose and was pissed.
He was pinned.
Pissed. Pinned and pissed. Yeah. Get me out of here, you know.
Tell me about your relationship with your dad, Pop Hill.
It was sterling in every way. He was the most wonderful guy in the world as far as I was concerned. Picture this. He's principal of a school in Flushing, New York, and the Japs hit Pearl Harbor. My wife was there at the time, but that's another story. And as soon as that happened, he went and signed up and came home in a military uniform without even telling my mother. He signed up right then and there. Next day.
That's an American war hero.
Yeah. Yeah, he spent the rest of the time in the Navy, which is another story, and never went to either front because the admiral at the Merchant Marine Academy at Kings Point wanted him there in the office, and so he worked with Admiral Tombstone, an unfortunate name, but a nice guy,
Right.
All during the war. Whereas my wife's father went in as a buck private, and at the end of the war was a bird colonel, getting promotion after promotion in the Japanese theater. And that's another story. He was Air Force.
Right.
And that's why my wife was at Hickam Field when the Japs hit. Well, Hickam Field is just one chain link fence from Pearl Harbor. So they saw it all.
Wow.
And the Jap planes she describes would fly over, and sometimes they'd be so low that she could see, she was 7 years old, she could see the expression on the pilots' faces as they came by.
Wow.
And the kids would run out not knowing what this is all about. They were kids, 7 years old.
Right.
They'd pick up pieces of the bombs, and she still has a couple of those pieces.
Wow.
Yeah. But that's another story.
But you had a great fishing relationship with your dad, and he had a very famous fly, the Pop Hill Special.
No, he had it.
Right.
I want to give him all the credit for it because it wasn't
But
me.
he designed that fly.
And that story deserves to be told if you want to hear it.
Yeah, no.
Would love
for
to.
Sure.
We had the Big Daddy, which was the name of my Carolina hull.
But all your boats were Big Daddy.
Yeah.
How'd you come up with that name?
Because I'm the Big Daddy. I got 7 kids.
Perfect. How apropos.
Then we figured out what was causing it, but that's another story.
That's awesome.
Well, anyway, He was the perfect father as far as I was concerned. I loved him, and so did my brother Dave and my brother Malcolm. He was just wonderful. He took us fishing whenever he went. He never went, once he had young boys like you and you, he never went fishing without taking us. And we fished all over Long Island, and my grandfather had been a very active trout fisherman in England before he came to the States as a teenager. And they were both consummate fly fishermen, and they wanted us kids to learn too. So, as I told you before, I learned before I remember getting any lessons.
Sure.
He'd let me make mistakes and then teach me by saying, you want to know how to avoid that sort of thing.
Right.
Which is what I did for years with my grandson, John, who is 21.
So what was the Pop Hill special?
Pop Hill special, okay. We're leading up to it. We had my mothership, and I had a flats boat on the foredeck with a davit. And we were on the backside of Andros, and Pop had a radical neck dissection just a couple of weeks before for cancer. It cured the cancer, and that's not what he died of, thank God. But he was just post-surgery, and he couldn't cast. But he sure didn't want to miss the strip. So he had just had his bandages off and all, and that's the way Pop was. And remind me, and I'll tell you another story of why I think he was the cat's ass. Okay, we're out there, and we're all bone fishing on the backside of Andros, the west side, on the flat. And, of course, I couldn't get the Big Daddy in close to the flat because it drew 5.5 feet. Sure. When we got to about 6 feet, we put over the hook and put over the skiff. And we had a couple of guests aboard, too, and they were all fishing in different places, and I was waiting with Pop near the shore. And Pop couldn't fish, but he stayed with me. And he stood still as a post, and he said, Gordy, he says, why don't you walk off here because they're seeing you? I says, who's seeing what? She says, the bonefish. They see you. You're moving around. Yeah, I'm fishing. Had a little argument over it. Now, he can't fish, man. So he stood there and observed like a post. And I moved off to stay out of his way. And he stood as still as a post, and he could do that, and just observed. Now, he's in water less than 2 feet deep. Might have been a foot deep. And he's absolutely still purposely because he wants to watch the bonefish feed. And when you're absolutely motionless, not even hardly breathing, they'll come right up to your feet almost in wild areas like that. And he noticed that every time a bonefish saw a little puff in the sand, he'd go and feed, sometimes tail up. And there'd be another puff, and another bonefish would do the same thing. He couldn't see what they were eating, but these little puffs, that's powder sand there.
Right.
Kind of like White Bay at Great Exuma, all powder white sand, snow white sand, fine.
Right.
And I came back and said, Pop, it's about time for lunch. He says, yeah, I got to go back to the boat. I says, well, I think he can pee here. He says, I've got to do something. We go back to the skiff and take the skiff back to the Big Daddy. And he gets out and he's so excited that he didn't have lunch. And we went back out and he had a little bait net. What he wanted to do was to scoop to see what these little creatures were that were making the puff. And he scooped several of them up, and they're not shrimp, but they're shrimp like copepods or something like that. But they're not shaped like shrimp, but they're just under the surface. And every now and then they puff, whether they're breathing or eating or moving, I don't know. But he had several of them, and every time he'd see the puffs, he'd scoop with that little bait net, and he'd come up with the same things. He figured, if I could tie a fly that does that, it doesn't have to look like that, but if it makes that puff, maybe the bonefish will go for that fly. So he made me stop fishing and help him back to the Big Daddy because he couldn't wait to tie a fly. And what he did was to take a little stainless steel hook, I think it was a number 4, monofilament body, and 2 hackles that were straight up hook point down. Why? He wanted to make a little plow.
Right.
See? And the idea was to put that out there, put the rod tip in the sand with a intermediate sink line, and do that with it, make a puff. And it did just that. That little hook point made a puff that looked just like the puffs that the bonefish were feeding on.
So the hook would drag in the sand and
Right.
make that little
Yeah,
puff.
the plow.
Exactly, little plow. And of course, I could cast, and he couldn't. So he asked me to try it. And I said, "Hey, Pop, that's not a bonefish fly. The hook's up, but he's got to be up." No, he says there's a reason for this, and I'll explain it to you later. So I went and made a couple of puffs. Boom, hooked up. Boom, hooked up again. Boom, hooked up again. It worked like magic.
Wow.
That's so ingenious.
Yeah.
But you were telling me earlier, when you walked into the Poon house, you looked at our flies. We're starting to talk about the worm hatch and the palola worm and hatches. Tell that story and about what you've seen here in the Bahia Honda area, the Lower Keys, about worms and hatching, and what you did back then to make the worm swim perfectly straight, and what you noticed with divers under the water.
Andy, before I do that, and I will, I'd like to tell you just a little bit more about the pophill fly.
Okay.
Because when I showed it to Lefty, who was a good friend of mine, he says, "It doesn't look like a bonefish, Gordon." You know how Lefty used to be. He says, "All right, if you say it's that good, I'll put it in my book." Well, he did, and with the first printing, he did like they do with all bonefish flies, and shows the hook point up. I got on the phone and said, "Lefty, that's not going to fly."
So he changed it in the illustration.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. He stopped the printing and put it down after I explained to him exactly how it worked.
What was your relationship like with Lefty?
Very, very good. He was a dear friend. I'd go up there and cast with him at Cockeysville, Maryland, to learn everything that he had to teach. I knew how to cast. I didn't need any lessons,
Right.
But even so, I like to know how other people do things. So I spent a couple of weeks with Joan Wolfe up in New York. She and I became the best of friends. Oh, gee, I remember last year. I was in her class to see how she taught. Not how to cast.
Right.
I knew how to cast, but to see how she taught. And she said, she didn't know me at that point, and she had us introducing one another, as you do in a classroom. And she said, "Well, Dr. Hill, how come you're here?" And I told her, "Well, I want to see how you do it. I'm a dear friend of Lefty's. You won't do well in this class." Joan. Oh, do you?
I do know Joan.
Okay,
Yes.
wonderful person.
Yes.
You're not going to do well in it. Well, everybody is looking at me and looking at her. And I said, "Well, Joan, I know the story about you and Lefty and your husband's white striped marlin. And the day he caught that, I happened to be in Ecuador. So we'll discuss that. You know that story."
I think I do. I think Lefty told me that story.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, let's go there. Let's go there right now.
Well,
tell me about Mr. Wolf's white marlin.
Yeah. Well, he was out there with a captain that I know in Ecuador very well, named Gomez, out of Salinas, fishing off the Punta Santa Elena. And back in those days, the striped marlin were everywhere. I had been there a couple of years before, and we would take the panga out and find a school of them tailing and then cast to them just like you do to tarpon.
Wow.
Not the trolling method using the teaser and all that.
Right.
But most people were using that method with teasers.
Were they eating well?
Oh, very
Free
well.
casting.
No problem. They take a fly like right now. That's another story.
But
anyway.
Lee Wolf's record was very scrutinized, if I'm not mistaken.
That's one word that could be used.
So I don't know the story. I'd love to hear it.
Okay, well, he was with a couple of guys, including an attorney who I just as soon not name, from Miami, a well-known attorney, and he caught that fish, no question about it. I was there at the time. I know he caught it. The word was, did that boat come out of gear before he made the cast, or did it not?
Oh.
And I can't tell you whether it did or not. But one of the attorneys who was with him would not, he would verify the catch, but he would not verify that it had been caught under strict IGFA rules. And it became a super issue.
Right.
Now, have you talked to Lefty about this?
I did speak to Lefty
So did I.
a number of years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then you know that story where if he told you the same story he told me, Lefty said, I'm not a wealthy man. And Lee Wolf is. And Lee Wolf came in and said, if you don't okay this, even though it didn't have the signature, I'm going to sue you for all you're worth. And Lefty admitted that he caved in and okayed it. In the meantime, that fish is still at Joan Wolf's school, mounted on the back wall of her classroom there.
Wow. I mean, what a legacy Joan Wolf and Lee had.
Now let's get back to Joan Wolf for a minute, if I may.
Yes.
Out in the so she looks at me as a pariah. I'm a lefty guy, and she doesn't cast like Lefty. Now the truth is, in subsequent years, I've had Lefty on my platform many, many times. I've had Joan on my platform many times. I've cast with both of them again and again. I'm here to tell you, when Joan is on my skiff in the salt, she casts just like Lefty. When Lefty is trout fishing on a little stream, he casts just like Joan. But each one has to have his or her raison d'etre, and they're pushing a concept.
Right.
You see?
Yeah, when you get out there in fishing conditions, the cast varies depending on the wind, the direction, all of that.
Exactly.
For sure.
But at the same time, there's simple steps to improve that cast into the wind, or whether it's a backhand cast or forehand cast, like stop the rod.
Well,
right?
it's all the same thing. You
Yeah.
have the double haul, you have to stop the rod, you have to turn the leader over,
Yeah.
Let's go with Joe Brooks. Joe Brooks was like the grandfather of saltwater fly fishing, if I'm not mistaken.
I think so.
Right?
Now,
and you caught your first bonefish on the same flat he caught his first
Yes, I did.
bonefish.
I did that purposely.
Where was that flat?
Outside of Bud and Mary's, on the ocean
On
side.
the ocean side.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
tell me about that.
Between there and Tea Table.
Right. Tell me about that relationship with Joe Brooks and your father and grandfather and yourself.
Well, they just knew each other. They were of same vintage and all, and both were super interested in saltwater fly fishing, and nobody else was. We never saw another person. I just finished rereading Van Kemp's Heiler's book on saltwater fishing, which was originally written in 1937, and then Van Kemp Heiler, and had all kinds of descriptions of every kind of saltwater fishing you can imagine, and he never even mentions saltwater fly casting or saltwater fly fishing, and it's an exhaustive book.
Wow.
Yeah. As an example, we never saw anybody with a fly rod before in the salt, and we were all over Long Island.
Right. So you were the first striper fisherman up there.
The first as far as I know.
Right.
Now, maybe somebody can come and prove to me that he was first.
Right.
I don't know. So it was a thing. Now, one day, we're walking along the beach on Long Island Sound toward Horton's Point, which is a rocky point at above Mattatuck, east of Mattatuck, at on the north shore of Long Island. And we're all walking along. I'm a little kid, about 6 years old, and I have my grandfather's bamboo rod and a Joe Brooks fly that I think he later called the Honey Blonde. And I can't wait to make any cane. You know how 6-year-old kids are. I'm running along ahead of them, and the two of them are coming up behind me because they can't keep up with a 6-year-old kid. And there were some surf casters there, and they looked like they'd been there all night. All this stuff was back in the rocks and all, and they were throwing big plugs, and the stripers were not real big ones, about 10-pounders, and they were feeding in the wash. Well, that was about the time they were pulling the plug out of the water, and then they'd make a long cast again. They couldn't figure why they weren't getting anything. And I walked past the first surf fisherman, and he looks back at me and says, "Hey, kid, what are you going to do with that thing?" Meaning my fly rod. Well, I'm a little kid, and I'm embarrassed. I just look down at the sand. Joe Brooks comes right up, and he says, "Just watch him." So I got between a couple of the surf casters. I may have made 3 or 4 casts, and I hooked a nice striper and landed him. And Joe comes up, picks up the striper, and holds it up to show the guys. And I felt about 10 feet tall.
Of course. Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. That's basically the story.
Who were your heroes, if you had any, or mentors in your early years?
Joe and my father and my grandfather.
And those were your formative years. How about when you got down here to Key West? Who were the players down here then, the guides and some of the anglers?
There weren't any, as far as I was concerned.
Yeah.
I taught the guides. They didn't teach me. First of all, the only guide, flats guide, was Gainey Maxwell. And he eventually gave up his skiff. It was known as the name of the boat was the Jetstream. It was a little jet boat.
Right.
He gave that up and started guiding from his big Hatteras, pulling guys' skiffs out to west of Key West to the Marquesas and the quicksands. There's some wonderful fishing there.
So tell me about the stories about when you came down here to Big Pine and you were trying to figure out sight fishing for oceanside tarpon or backcountry tarpon with worms. What were the flies you were using? And that was an exploration period just on your own, correct? You didn't fish with guides.
No.
You learned this all on your own.
Yeah. I'll get to that. But the first real guide to come down here to Key West was Bob Montgomery.
Right.
And he was a great guy. And then second was Gene Montgomery, his brother. Gene was more interested in fishing 23-footer deep V's offshore than fishing the flats, whereas Bob continued on the flats. And we helped those guys out with what we had already learned. We learned by doing. Now, you asked me about the flies. These are flies that probably don't resemble anything you fish with, except that one you showed me when we first came in.
A little shrimp pattern.
Yeah, a little, if you can call it a shrimp pattern. It's a critter.
Yeah, critter.
It's a critter. Yeah, and we used long hackle orange flies and all long hackle black flies, and just experimented. My father was a great fly tyer, and after he retired, I'd be putting hips in people and doing other orthopedic surgery. I did a lot of spine fusions too. And he would be retired, and he'd be at my home in my den where I had a whole fly tying setup, tying flies. Why my place? Because we had a Olympic-sized swimming pool there, and he could get in the pool with his fly. He'd put the fly on a little leader and all. He'd dive with it because he always wanted to see what it did when you pulled it, when you're down underwater with that fly. That was his thing. To make it look like a critter or just something that just irresistible, like the flare of a
the feather, splayed feathers.
Feather, split feather, that sort of thing. And he'd have to see it himself, and then we'd go and try him out. And that was fly. I'll give you one example. We're out off Cosgrove when they used to have the Cosgrove Light there off the Marquesas, just south of the Marquesas. And there was a hatch of young yellowtails, and they were big yellowtail snapper eating their own young.
Wow!
And we tried all kinds of flies that we had been catching yellowtails on. They wouldn't take them, including the simple yellow bucktail fly. So this is how Pop would think. He scooped up one of those juvenile, maybe an inch long fry. A juvenile yellowtails, And he said, if we forget that, they're eating that. So he took a sharp knife, put it on my cooler, and took and gave it a buzz cut. Boom! Right behind the hook. And it looked just like one of those little things. And it was exactly the right size. And we caught all kinds of yellowtail on that.
Wow.
And talk about match the hatch.
Yes.
Right.
And that's the kind of fly tyer he was. He would make up things. And I followed suit. I can remember my first peacock bass. It was in Florida at my daughter's home on one of the lakes in west of Hollywood, where she lived. And here was a beautiful, nice peacock bass just sitting there. And I had my fly rod in the car, and I ran and got it. No flies. So I took a hook and a pipe cleaner and a piece of kitchen sponge, put it on there, and just wound it real quick, and figured, now that looks like a critter. I made one cast and took an 8-pound peacock.
Wow.
You see, because of Pop's training.
Sure.
That's the way he did things.
Right.
If he'd take a nap, he's a lot like Lefty. Lefty always took a nap on the foredeck. And he'd only have one thing to eat for lunch, nothing else, a peanut butter sandwich. And Pop was the same way. He'd take a nap. Now, we all knew, the guys in my fishing club, Pop and I were members, and for the beginning, Ferd Heeb was president, and then I was president for a little while, but that doesn't matter. Anyway, they would all notice that if Pop got up from his nap and he stretched and he looked around and surveyed, if he didn't take a rod and make a cast, you weren't going to catch any fish. If he got up and he looked around and suddenly wanted to grab his rod, you better start fishing because he's seen something that you didn't.
Right.
That kind of thing.
He was fishy, as they say.
Yeah, fishy. And that's the way Lefty has always been.
Right.
Tell me about your first worm hatch.
I was with Ted Jurassic. You know Ted.
Yes.
He was a member of our fishing club. And I'll say that when he got up to talk with his Hungarian accent, even if he was serious, he'd have the guys slapping their knees and laughing. Wonderful guy. Now, you got this spinning rod, you guys, and you got to listen to me, because if the roller don't roll, you ain't going to catch no fish. And they're all...
That's so well done.
Yeah, well, he and I have been friends for half a lifetime. Anyway, he had a lot of experience fishing Montauk, too. And his first business was out on Long Island at Ronkonkoma out there. He had a great big factory with 200 or more workers. And
Wow.
Yeah. And he came from Hungary with $8 in his pocket.
Sure.
And a brilliant guy. Never had a college education or anything, but one of the smartest people I've ever met. He's worth millions now,
Yeah,
as you
for
probably
sure.
know.
Yeah.
And that's through his mind.
Right.
One of the things he invented, as you probably know, is a flexible stainless steel pipe that the oil companies bought.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah.
I can only imagine what that patent's worth.
Who knows?
Yeah, right.
And a bright guy and a wonderful man.
Yeah, for sure.
Wonderful man. Anyway, so we're getting to the worm hatch, believe it or not. We were on what we call the Kawasaki, which is the white flat right on the ocean side of Bahia Honda with the little rocky island that used to have terns nesting there. Now they don't, because the public has
Right.
walked. The reason we called it the Kawasaki was because we stopped fishing it when the Kawasaki jet skis would go back and forth. There's no purpose in being there.
Right.
But that was before the jet skis. So we're there, and it's getting to be evening, and all of a sudden we see some commotion in the water, and we see these little critters swimming by, and it was Teddy who first announced it. He said, "It's a worm hatch." It's a worm hatch.
So you guys weren't there looking for the worm hatch. You
No.
just stumbled upon it.
We didn't know about it.
Yeah, right.
No, it turns out that Al Fluger knew about it. And Al was a good friend, and I fished with Al many times, and Al was a fantastic fly fisherman. Pop and I were out there in our skiff, and we watched him land his world record at Atlantic big eye tuna. Years later, on 12-pound test. Years later, I had the 12-pound tippet record for the Pacific big eye tuna, but that's another story. So it's all since been, going by the way, because one thing about world records is they're always beaten.
For sure.
Yeah, it's just the way it is, and I'm not interested in trying for another.
Although you have one that will probably stand for the rest of time, possibly.
Nothing stands for the rest of time.
Yeah.
I'm a big boy.
Yeah, you know the difference.
I know the story.
But but you caught a 15-pound, 4-ounce bonefish that has been in the record book since 1997.
Exactly.
It's hard to find those big bonefish now.
Wait a minute. However, I have caught 5 fish larger than that. Okay? On a certified scale.
When was the last time you caught one of those, though?
Oh, it was 2001.
Yeah, and that was right before the big freeze, when a lot of those bonefish died.
Well, quite a bit before. It was the big freeze was in 2010.
Right.
That was I live just below the No Name Key Bridge, on the outside there.
Right.
On the point, and I've caught 5 fish larger than the 15-pound fish, but never 16. Almost, but bigger than the one that I got.
Right.
But I didn't have everything you need. The witness,
the scale.
I do a lot of fishing alone.
Right.
I know what I catch. I know what it weighs. I used to. I don't anymore, but I used to carry a certified scale with me. I had it checked regularly at our fishing club. I had it checked at IGFA, so I know what the weights were.
Sure.
Also, in my old age, I don't want to kill fish.
Right.
We used to bring tarpon, slide them in the boat, take all kinds of pictures and everything. Right. We don't do anything like that anymore.
No, neither do we. Well, let's go back to the worm hatch.
Okay. So here we see these little worms. We feel, what? And Ted has just announced it. But we see this more commotion out to the right on what we now call the worm bank, which is on the other side of the channel. Right. Bahia Honda Channel. Well, we went out there and made a few casts with orange splayed hackle tarpon flies. Didn't resemble a worm at all, but back then they'd hit almost anything. Right. There's no other boats there or anything. And we jumped 4 or 5 fish, landed one, and then it started to get dark and we went home. Pretty simple.
Right. But you also told me about you had some friends that were diving and you sent divers down. What did they see?
Yeah, this was a couple of years later, several years later. And we noticed that first of all, the worms would always come from the northeast with an outgoing tide. And during that time, before they start coming the other way, they would have their tails up and their heads down. And we figured there must be something going on down there. So we put Dick Saul and a couple of the other guys in my fishing club who had tanks, put them down under the boat with the idea of observing, seeing what happens. And what they saw was very simple. They would see all of a sudden when you were near the Honda Channel, not if you were way far away from it, but when you were near the edge of the channel, the western edge, you would see a ball of these worms. Of course, they're not worms, they're epitokes. The tail, they're gametes, sexual gametes of the Palola worm.
So they break off.
Yeah, but they would all do it at once and there'd be a ball of them. And then all of a sudden a tarpon's mouth would come near and he'd just suck them all up. Then he'd come up to the surface and you'd see the tarpon. Maybe he'd roll, maybe he wouldn't. And it happened again and again and again. Now and then we'd see a tarpon take one worm on the surface. But that's not what they were doing for the most part. And biologically, it made sense to us. Because if a tarpon has to use more energy to catch one worm than he gets from eating it, biologically, that makes no sense at all. Right. And so it figured. And because of that, what we started doing was using intermediate sinking lines, clear lines. Back then, sometimes these were lines we made ourselves, but that's another story. You know, in Flip Pallett's book where he discusses him and Lefty and Sosin and those guys sanding monofilament to make. Right. Hell, we figured that it'd take all night to do that. And how are you going to get the taper right? So what we did was to just make a 30-foot long tapered leader. Now that's a head, you see, with a monofilament running line behind it. Well, yeah, it had knots, but you had that out of the rod tip.
Right.
By the time you cast it, you could make one of them in 15 minutes.
So how heavy was the monofilament that was on the reel? That you were casting.
We called that the running line.
Yeah, and how heavy was that?
We would experiment, but we came to the conclusion that 30-pound test was a good average.
Right. So tell me about your fly design with the snell knot and making the worm swim and using that sinking line.
We wanted the worm to be as natural looking as possible, and to be as natural looking as possible, it had to swim like a worm. And if you used an eye and a loop on there, it would go back and forth. Didn't resemble the way worms swim at all. So what we started doing was, and we're not the only one that did it, because I have to be honest, tell you that Gordon Baggett, you know who he is?
No, I don't.
Okay. Right now, he's at Cudjoe Key, and he runs a guide service there. And those guys are probably out. Well, I don't know. It's pretty windy, but they're probably out right now. He's got several guides, and he was the one who put us onto that. It wasn't my invention. Where you tie the tippet, it's the bite tippet, but it's not a bite tippet. It's a piece of light tippet. If you really want to get a strike. Like 10-pound test or less, and you tie it onto the hook before you tie the fly. Then curl it up. If it's heavy, like if you want to land a fish, you'd use 40-pound test and even fluorocarbon, and then you'd wind it up until you've got a roll of leader bite tippet that's about an inch in diameter, so that you can get your bobbin over it and wind that the shaft of the hook onto or vice versa, the end of the tippet onto the hook. Then you tie the fly. You can do that because now the bobbin will go around that. Sure. Then you untangle it, put the hook, when you finish, the trick is to on my fly tying desk and on my skiff, I have a stainless strap on the console. I hook the hook onto that and I pull on it, especially if it's fluorocarbon. Then I take my fingers after stretching it and go back and forth to heat it up.
Heat it up and get it straight.
Heat it up, yeah, and then hold it while it cools. That's the end of the secret. And now you got a straight tippet.
Right.
And it just takes a few seconds. But Pop figured that out, not me.
But the idea of snelling the hook instead of the loop knot was just so the worm would swim straight.
Pull straight.
Yeah.
You have control of how it does it.
So you were actually fishing for these tarpon during the worm hatch up on that bar, almost like nymph fishing the tarpon, where you get the worm down off that bar where they were hatching and trying to catch these fish that were kind of like head down, gulping the masses.
Here's my thought, and I can't prove it. I think that if I slowly retrieved it, like you might a nymph, or let the current take it, but just keep up with it, that maybe my fly with that leader, that straight leader, might get into a ball, right, and the fish was eating the ball and happens to get my fly.
Were you pretty successful with that technique?
Very successful. Yeah, Brandon Henley just called. He's a guide here on Big Pine, and he just called me. Right now he's fishing a spot that I know very well in the Virgin Islands, and that's another story. But I said, Gordy, he says, I remembered your story about fishing them with the slow sink transparent line. And I was out at the worm hatch the other night with my client, and nobody was catching a fish. And I did exactly what you told me to do and let that sink and then just bring it along near the bottom. Now and then you snag the bottom, and then you wish you hadn't. Yeah. But and he said my client got a 120-pounder.
Wow.
Nobody else caught a fish.
And you always you told us right when you walked in.
This is just a few days ago.
Right. And you told us, before the podcast started, that you always cast it up current and you stripped it down current.
Because
Yeah.
worms swim with the
This
falling
is what I
tide.
mean by keeping up with it, because you don't want the fly here in a belly of loose line.
Sure.
So you retrieve at about the speed that the current is going, which is judgment.
And you also told us that there are worm hatches that take place in the winter.
Did I say that?
Can you talk a little bit about that?
The secret is out.
Yeah, it's very simple. I fish tarpon all year round, have for many years. I don't just fish during tarpon season. And it's more of a thrill during the winter because you got to find them. And now what I like, what gives me my jollies, is to be alone on the boat, nobody else, and I'm spending the day finding fish. I might start at 6 in the morning or 5, running out on a dawn patrol. You know when you run out to the back country at Big Pine here and you see those stakes?
Yeah.
I put them all out there.
Really?
Yeah. My father and I did that many years ago. And we put light reflector tape on them.
Just like Mark Croak up in Isla Morada.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Except we did it before he did.
Oh, of course. You're 90.
Yeah. Well,
I mean, that was very ingenious of you guys.
Yeah, because we'd run out. I'd get up at 4 o'clock in the morning, hop in the skiff, and go out. No breakfast, because I'm going to eat that when I come back.
Right.
And I want to be out there, but I want to get out there safely. I've seen some hellacious things on the way out, because sometimes I'll be running out and I see some disturbance in the water, and it might be halfway out there where my stakes still are. I stop and watch, put my flashlight out there, and I've got a big bright flashlight, and every now and then, even during the winter, I'll see worms. Now there, it's not at dusk the way it is off Bahia Honda. It's early in the morning. Well, what do you think? I stop and fish. Sometimes get a fish before I get out to any of my honey holes out in the contents.
And these are Palolo worms?
Yeah. Yep.
When did you first see this?
Back in the 70s.
Do you know of anybody else that has recognized that hatch?
Not that I know of, and I haven't broadcast it. Right. Now that I'm 90, I don't care. I want to help other people catch fish.
Right. Well, the contents were a very special place for you and your father. And when he passed, he wanted his ashes spread out there in the contents.
Exactly.
Tell me about the contents and the relationship with you guys.
Well, we would fish all around the contents. That was our favorite venue. Now, on the content, there's a long white spot. There's some deep water that used to have tarpon in it, right up next to the shore where the mangroves are. Now we don't see so many tarpon there, even during tarpon season, although occasionally you do. But it fans out to a very shallow bar on the west side there, and we would anchor the boat, always 2 anchors, because we almost lost a skiff one time with 1 anchor. I learned that the hard way, almost. And we always used 2 anchors, or an anchor and a push pull, but always 2 methods of securing the skiff. Then we'd wade that flat, and that was my father's favorite flat, because the bonefish had come across there and they would eat, and they were big. That was my favorite. Well, on the rock bar before you get to there, that's where I've taken many guys to catch their first permit on fly. Because for some reason, when they come around that corner and they hit that rock bar, they're looking for food on the incoming tide, not the outgoing. My largest permit there on my own scale, it's a 50-pound scale, was 42 pounds.
Wow.
Yeah.
And the world record by Del Brown and Steve Huff on 8-pound test is 42.
Yeah, I know. Well,
but you also caught a really big tarpon. I mean, from what I understand, you caught like a 200-pound tarpon on 12-pound test off of Bullfrog Bank. Is that correct?
Oh, no, that's not true. I caught that fish in Homosassa.
A 200-pounder on 12.
No, it wasn't 200 pounds.
You caught a 161 in Homosassa.
Yes.
For some reason, I got my notes wrong. But
I never caught a 200-pounder.
Right. Well, Peter lied.
Peter Lammy.
Peter lied. Tell me about, so Joe Brooks.
Okay. Okay, off Bullfrog Bank. Now I know what the story.
Because the note says that you hooked a 200-pound fish at 6 p.m. and landed it at 1 in the morning.
That's true, but the truth is we don't know what it weighed
Right.
because it's 1 o'clock or 1:10 in the morning, and we're so tired we didn't even tape it out. But looking at him, we think it could have gone 200 pounds. But the
Wow.
truth is, I don't know that.
Right.
But it was the biggest tarpon I've ever seen.
And you've seen a lot of big ones.
And I don't know why a shark didn't get it with all those hours of fighting.
Right. Well, you also, so Joe Brooks caught a 148 with Stu Apt. Then Stu Apt broke his record with like a 150 something. Did you break Stu's record? Was that an official record, that 161 you caught in Homosassa?
No. Why? Because I wasn't interested in records at the time.
Killing a fish.
Yeah. But let me tell you about that fish. Because this goes back to the early 60s. There was no fishery there for big tarpon, except for Anthony Weston Dimmock, who years and years before had caught a tarpon at the mouth of the Homosassa River from his canoe.
Right.
And you probably read all about that.
The Book of Tarpon.
Yeah. But the guides there, they were fishing for other species mostly, and they were bait fishermen. There were no fly fishermen there back then that I knew of, at least. So I had a boat that I had built. It was a 20-foot skiff with a Palmer inboard gasoline engine with an updraft carburetor that made in Cooscob, Connecticut. And I had made that when I was in the Army in my backyard. And we brought it to New York after I got out of the Army, and had it fished it on Long Island, caught all kinds of fish there. But then when I came to Florida in 1962, I brought it down with me. We decided we'd explore the west coast of Florida, which we did in that boat. It was a pain in the neck because it was an inboard screw with a skeg, and I kept hitting bottom and all that. I knew I had to get rid of that boat. We figured we'd go up, maybe find some deeper water around Tampa, which we did. We didn't find a tarpon around Tampa until we got to Boca Grande. And of course, you know that story. They're all in the pass there. And,
Sure.
And it wasn't the kind of fishing we wanted to do. So we moved up further to Homosassa. We stayed at Mary's Fish Camp there, which is really a trailer camp.
Right.
Rented one of her trailers, and we put that in the at the little river there, which was the Weeki Wachee, and went out off Homosassa. We never got to Black Rock or any of it. We were probably on what later became known as Oklahoma.
Right.
And you know what that is.
Sure, the white sand flats out there.
Yeah, you could call it a flat, but it was average depth was 3 or 4 feet.
Right.
And good for tarpon, not a bonefish flat. But you know, it had those outcroppings of rock, and every now and then my rudder or wheel would hit that, and we thinking, oh boy. So we didn't travel very fast. We just put-putted along, and then we decided to see if we could find some tarpon. And the way we did it was to just drift. And along comes a school of tarpon. I'd never seen tarpon that big before. Well, I cast to them, and it was before we knew about bite tippets. So, of course, you know what happens. Every fish that I hooked, I lost. I was fishing with a 12-weight bamboo rod. 12-weight bamboo rod, very flexible. I was using a Hardy Marquis trout reel because it had a rim drag.
The music, too.
Yeah. And we loved the Hardy screech when a bonefish goes, it was just great. I can remember Ted Jurassic chiding me about that. He says, Gordy, what do you want to fish with that crap for? We got real reels. You know, I said, because I love that screech. He says, you're crazy. Like one time I was fishing that, and Ted was taking me to his secret redfish spot. We got to get there at dawn. He says, now, Gordy, when the redfish come, you're going to see him come around the point there, and you got to be ready. Time went by. I'm half asleep and up early in the morning and all that. The tides change. The sun's up. They're not coming. And there's none. He says, Gordy, he says, if the redfish don't come. You ain't going to see no redfish. Anyway,
Classic Ted Jurassic.
get away from that story. But anyway, now we're in Homosassa. It's in the 60s, the early 60s. And now I'm fishing with this outfit, and I figured that if I put 20-pound test on there, right to the fly, maybe they won't all break off, because they'd all break the fly off. It wasn't a real bite tip. It was just ordinary monofilament,
Right.
20-pound test. And I hooked a big fish right there, right at the tip of the lip. God sent that fly in there.
Yes.
Because he couldn't go through the 20.
Sure.
I had him on the longest time, and my attitude back in those days was, well, I'm going to hold on to him until he dies of old age. Then I'll motor up to him, and I got the fish. It was a different way of fishing.
Yes, that was a number of hours.
Like Billy
Totally
Pate.
different than the way you do it, where you put max pressure for the
Sure.
tippet. See, we hadn't learned that yet. And I don't know how long I was on that fish, but my father kept looking at his watch. Gordon, it's going to get to be night. You're not going to land that fish. But I did. I brought him up to the gunnel, and we didn't have a proper gaff for that. So Papa reaches over and puts his hand in the gill, and damn near gets pulled overboard. But we slide that fish up onto the gunnel, and even back then we knew the formula, what we called the IGFA formula, but it was not. It was a guy named Wood who originally described it years before. I don't know if you knew that.
What was the formula that you were using
You
then?
take the girth in inches at the widest point,
Right?
square it, multiply it times the length of the fish from the tip of the snout to the fork of the tail,
Right.
divide by 800.
Right. We still use that.
Same formula.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it works on so many different fish.
Yeah.
It's not just tarpon.
Well, let's
And that fish was 161 pounds.
right.
Or maybe 162. I mean,
Yeah,
it's
it
an
was big.
approximation.
Yeah. Let's
Now, but you asked me about that big fish off the bank.
yeah, the bullfrog.
Bullfrog Bank.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was about 6 o'clock in the evening. And Dave Sylvester was with me. He's still alive, but he's an old guy like me, retired. And I hooked that fish at the edge of the last white bank before you go a little bit north and hit the bullfrog marker. That's the flat. And these fish came along, and this was the second fish in line, big female. And I hooked her, don't even remember what fly. Well, we fought that fish. She wouldn't jump. I mean, she'd swirl in the water like a big female sometimes does. Like she wants to jump, but she doesn't get
Too
off.
heavy to get out.
Yeah. And we fought that fish and we got way back toward the ocean side and didn't even know for sure where we were. Didn't have GPS in those days. Excuse me. But I could see the lights on Big Pine,
Right.
and all that. So I knew where I was, but not specifically. And we fought that fish to the edge of what was probably the bank off Little Pine Key, which is pretty close to home. Well, it got to be midnight, and my wife calls me on the radio and she says, guys, if you're not coming in, you'll find your dinner in the oven. I'm going to bed. That was at midnight. Well, it was 10 minutes after 1 before we got that fish right up alongside. And we had to lean over with the tape measure to get an idea of the length, but we couldn't get it around for the girth, so we figured the heck with it. We're both so tired it doesn't matter. But both Dave and I figured that's the biggest tarpon we have ever seen anywhere. And it seemed to us, at least, to be much bigger than that 160 pound estimated tarpon that I had gotten in Homosassa. But I don't know, to tell the truth.
Yeah, no, for sure.
But
you had a huge life traveling the world fishing.
Yes.
What was one of your favorite locations?
Two of my favorite locations were the Galapagos Islands, 900 miles off the coast of Ecuador, just fantastic. And Australia. I spent about 6 weeks on one trip in Australia. It was our 50th wedding anniversary, and our kids, all our 7 kids, got together and paid for the trip for us as a anniversary present.
Good for
Kind of
them.
nice.
Yeah.
And Lefty helped me a lot because he had introduced me to his counterpart, Harrow. I don't know if you've ever met Harrow.
No.
Rex Harrison?
No.
Oh, man. Rod Harrison. Not Rex. Rod Harrison. He's since been my guest tarpon fishing here. And I used a trick to catch big tarpon on fly in the middle of the day in the middle of the Bahia Honda Channel, which I can get into, but it'll change the subject. And Rod caught several big fish that way using that trick.
But you had a big life traveling the world, catching so many fish. Which
Yeah.
is bigger, your medical life or your fishing life? Because
Both were huge.
they were.
Yeah, I was an active guy.
Yeah, you were. Well, we so appreciate your story. I've heard about you for a long time through our mutual friend Paul Dixon, and we tried to do this last year, and with the COVID, it was delayed, and finally we got your story, and it's so enjoyable.
I'm
to
sure
meet
we didn't
you.
even scratch the surface, but
No, you haven't.
But thank you so much for joining us today.
It's been my pleasure.
thanks so much, Gordy, and we'd love to have you back on.
Hey, that's doable.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, pal.
What I saw is West Side Story. What I saw is just a